Anybody want to guess?
North Dakota?
You got her. Now, here's where it gets tougher. How many pounds of honey does North Dakota produce in an average year?
I'm going to guess 35 million pounds.
Anybody else want to challenge that figure? Hey, the winner gets an all-expense-free trip to Wilsaw. So,
Okay, I'll render a guess. How about 24 million pounds?
I'm going to guess 40 million.
20 million.
okay.
Like the price is
The
right.
winner is, I hope you like Wilsaw, they produce 36.8 million pounds of honey. Next question. How about Montana? Where does Montana sit?
Yeah, Montana usually ranks in the top 5 states for honey production, and typically it's around 15 million pounds of honey in Montana.
We've been as high as number 2 in 1915. And it's the 10th most valuable crop produced in the state of Montana. So that gives you a pretty good idea of what we do with honey here. First question from Missoula, and also similar from Gardner for Jane. Is applying nitrogen to cheatgrass a good idea?
Yeah, the short answer is no. And well, I guess if you wanted to grow cheatgrass, it would be good to apply nitrogen. But in general, these kind of weedy, fast-growing species, they do better when you apply nitrogen in particular. So if you're battling cheatgrass, applying nitrogen is not something you would want to do.
You encourage a weed. It's not a noxious weed, but an obnoxious weed. Is that correct?
Right, yes, for sure. It is a regulated plant in Montana, so you aren't required to control it like you are a noxious weed, but we do try to limit its movement in seed, hay, etc.
Okay, thank you. Michelle, a question from Missoula. They say they see a lot of different colored honeys, and I mentioned that to you ahead of time, and you brought in a couple. Can you explain why there's so much variation in the color of honey that they purchase in stores?
Yeah, and so honey is just really dried down nectar. Honeybees collect nectar for their carbohydrate resource, and they collect pollen and do pollination services as when they are collecting pollen. But these are 2 honeys I have right in front of me here. This is from last year from Montana State University's honeybee colonies, and this is this year's. It's much lighter. Lighter honeys are usually associated with pollinating things like alfalfa, gives you a lighter tasting honey. The darker honeys can be from a different species of different clover, although they can range from light to dark as well. And honey takes on the flavor of the nectar that it's where the bees collect the nectar from. So, for example, in San Francisco, they have lots of eucalyptus, so they have eucalyptus honey. And we generally in the stores, you buy a blend so that the flavor and color is consistent in kind of the stores. But if you buy wildflower honey or citrus blossom honey, you'll taste different flavors, and that's due to the nectars that the bees gathered.
That brings up a question, and I haven't paid a lot of attention to honey because to me it all looks the same, it kind of tastes the same. But I've been in stores where you see, say, an 8-ounce container of honey that may be priced at $5, and then you go down the aisle and there's a 6-ounce container that's $15. What's the variation in price and why?
Yeah, so honey will vary in price. If you buy a blended honey that's produced by, Sue Bee Honey, a general honeybee packager, that's going to be lower cost than honey that was just produced locally or has some special, maybe if it's only wildflower honey, it'll cost in the mid-range. And then there's some specialty honeys. One of them is Manuka honey, which is produced in Australia and New Zealand. And those bees forage on the tea tree plants. And so some people say it maybe has medicinal properties, it has, it serves as an antioxidant, and so then that can be marketed and sold at a higher price point.
Is there a big difference in taste?
Yeah, so actually there is a big difference in taste. So the 2 jars I have in front of me, I think I like the lighter, less flavorful honey, but I think it's kind of like wine, right? Some people like different tasting wine, and honey is the same. The darker ones in general have a stronger flavor. And so, yeah, there's definitely a difference in taste.
Okay, thank you. I learned something tonight, which is not hard. This question came in from Facebook during the week, and it was from Brian and Helena. And this person has bugs all over the side of their house. He says they look like box elder bugs, but he thinks they're bigger and browner. And I think box elder have some red on them, if I remember right. Any idea what they are?
It could be the Western conifer seed bug, and I did bring one with me today because I've been getting a lot of calls about them. So the Western conifer seed bug is very similar in behavior to the box elder bug. It's looking for a place to come in and spend the winter, but it is harmless. It's associated mostly with Douglas fir and pine seeds. And mostly it doesn't do any damage to any of the Douglas fir or pine that it comes into contact with. But we've had a big year for them, and I mean, I was just up in Helena yesterday, and they were all over the buildings, and just they like to sit on the south and southwest facing sides. But they're harmless. They're not gonna bite. They don't reproduce inside. But hopefully over the weekend we'll get a big cold spell, and
We're due.
We're due. Yeah.
Yeah, so that should take care of it. Quick one here for Abby from Livingston. There are tulip bulbs arrived late that they ordered. Is it too late to put them in the ground?
No, you can still put tulips and other early spring flowering bulbs in, but I'd get them in the next week or so.
Okay, thank you. This is interesting. This person has a hive, and a bear, probably a black bear, attacked his hive and ate the honey. The queen is still alive, and some of the other bees. How can they keep the hive alive through the winter? Good question.
Yeah, so if your colony's been damaged and then lost its food reserves to a bear, what I would be recommending is feeding that colony now. And you wouldn't want to feed it a lot of protein. There's pollen and protein patties that beekeepers buy, but you wouldn't want to feed them that in the fall because that encourages brood or young bee rearing. But definitely giving them a little boost would be good. There's also kind of some sugar patties you can make, so that way they can eat on that during the fall and winter. But I would definitely try to get a little bit more food in there since the bear took their food reserves.
Yeah, bears have become a much more serious problem with our honey producers, especially along the Front Range, Great Falls area, Choteau, DuPuy, or up in that area.
Yeah, and a good friend had the same thing happen last fall to her colony, and she pieced it back together, and the bees did survive the winter. And so I hope
There's hope.
Yeah, there's hope.
Michelle, what's typical for taking care of a honeybee hive over the winter?
So typically, and you actually do have to harvest the honey. You know, it's not because they have to work hard to keep their colony warm in the winter. So the queen will be in the center of what's called the cluster, and they'll cluster around her. The bees actually detach their wings from their muscles and kind of just vibrate them to keep the colony nice and warm during the winter. And so if their house is a little bit smaller, then they don't have as much room to keep. But then you still need to keep enough honey so that they can eat during the winter months. And so probably that's the biggest thing to get ready for. We kind of baby the bees at Montana State University. We put a little bee cozy around them to keep them a little bit warmer. But the worst thing you could have in a bee colony over winter is condensation. And so if you put the cozy on wrong and you encourage condensation in there, that's worse than doing nothing at all. So they've evolved to keep themselves warm over the winter.
Even at 30, 40 below, they'll generally survive if protected and have sufficient food.
Yeah, I think so. You know, so there's definitely beekeepers in Canada, north of us, that overwinter colonies. So yeah, they can make it. You know, windbreak would be a good idea. We've used hay and straw bales for windbreaks and things like that. And then commercial beekeepers now, there is a movement for commercial beekeepers to be moving some of their bees into called what's winter storage, and that can be like a potato cellar in Idaho, for example, or there's now even bee overwintering structures. And so some commercial beekeepers have gone to that to increase survival over the winter, because you do lose colonies over the winter.
I've been told that about 2/3 of bees that live in Montana and North Dakota winter, and almond orchards down in California. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. So I was just going to mention that. So most of Montana's beekeepers, commercial beekeepers, move their colonies. They move about 270,000 colonies to the Central Valley of California, and they start that moving process at about Thanksgiving time. And they stage the colonies there for the world's largest pollination event, which is the California Almond Bloom, that is in late February or early March.
Yeah, it's interesting. Lori, and I don't know where this came from, but it says, is there a reason there were so many leaf miner problems this year?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think they probably just overwintered really well, and I don't know what type of leaf miner they're talking about, if they're talking about the beet leaf miner or leaf miners in trees. But yeah, they probably just, we had a mild winter and they probably survived pretty well. So usually those are pretty harmless depending on what we're talking about. But yeah, we did see a lot of leaf miners this year.
The good thing about them, they got my spinach earlier this year than they normally do.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
they really like spinach.
They do.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Yeah, this is a good one. Came in last week, we didn't get to it. Actually, a couple weeks ago. From Billings, the viewer is tired of his bluegrass lawn. He says it takes too much work and too much water. What are some better alternatives, particularly that are dog friendly?
Yeah, that's a good question, and especially with water restrictions and watering issues, bluegrass is pretty water intensive for a lawn, but fine fescue or turf type tall fescue are some grasses that do really well. They look very similar to bluegrass. They require less fertilizer, less water, and would be dog friendly, would be a good option for your yard.
You know, there's been a movement toward xeriscaping or using no plants in yards, so you reduce water use. Is that catching on at all in Montana?
I think it is, and in various cities, they're encouraging people. The city is encouraging people to swap out or to reduce just the amount of turf grass that they have to help conserve water or to help use it more efficiently. But xeriscaping or non-irrigated landscaping is becoming more popular, especially with drought-related issues that we see more and more.
We are getting shorter and shorter of water in a lot of cities. There's no doubt about that. This is from Missoula. For Michelle, this person noted a lot fewer bees in his yard this year in comparison to previous years. Has this been observed in other areas of Montana or just in the Missoula area?
Yeah, so it definitely depends on the situation. We were just talking about water, so water comes to mind. Sometimes bees, and definitely honeybees, go and collect water too. So sometimes if you had a slight drip in your hose, you would have bees visiting to collect water. Or if you had different blooming plants, bees would visit your yard differentially. If he's talking about honeybees, there could have been a closer resource for them that year. They'll kind of go to the most close resource. There's also hundreds of native and wild bee species in Montana, so depending on how those bumblebees overwintered in the ground. It kind of depends on what bees he's talking about. But there is a wild bee survey of Montana going on when Dr. Mike Ivey is leading that, and Casey Delphia is involved, and Abby here is involved as well. And so I couldn't speak to the Missoula area of how their bees are faring in general, but probably with just one yard it would be hard to tell. But these could be some reasons why you saw less bees this year.
And conversely, I think I saw more bees this year here in the Bozeman area than I have in years past. Does that mean that wet spring we had here was favorable for bees, or it created more flowers or more noxious weeds for them to feed on?
Yeah, I think that probably the nice moisture we had this spring and pretty much throughout the summer, we had a good summer here in Bozeman, is good for the bees. They have more to forage on, more nectar to collect. But then, of course, in the northeastern part of the state where it was much drier, harder there. So definitely bees need water for themselves, and then the plants that they forage on definitely need water.
Okay,
It
thank
seemed
you.
like it was late too. Like everything was 2 or 3 weeks late, and
That's
I
true.
noticed both doing field field work, but also just out hiking and whatnot, that it took a while before the wild bees really started
came
flying this summer.
Yeah. And we give our bees a little bit of food in the spring just to get them over that couple 2 weeks, you know, in case they've broken their cluster, they're looking for forage, but we might not necessarily have it. We have that early dandelion bloom, and as soon as the trees bloom, bees are happier then. They can get some food.
Okay, thank you. Jane, this person has thistles in his yard, doesn't say which kind, I suspect they're probably Canada thistles, and would like to control them. Any suggestions on what they can use, and can they still do it this fall?
Does it say where the viewer's calling
Bozeman.
from Bozeman? I live right in Bozeman, and I haven't had a hard frost yet at my house, so I think there'd still be time. And you could use like a 2,4-D or dicamba product if he's looking for a herbicide recommendation. There's also, I've mentioned this on the show before, but Roundup for lawns. And I've been trying that on different species in my yard, and it seems to work fairly well. I don't have Canada thistle, so I haven't tried it on that. But if the viewer does want to check that out, make sure you get Roundup for lawns and not just Roundup in general, because Roundup in general is glyphosate, which is non-selective, and it will kill everything. But the Roundup for lawns is a combination of I think there's actually 3 different active ingredients in there, and they're all broad-leaved herbicides.
And as a follow-up to that, I've also heard, do you recommend cutting off the seed heads so it doesn't spread more, or not really? It's too late for that, or?
Well, it's probably too late. I mean, Canada thistle would have been flowering a while ago, and I would, if it's in his lawn, he probably has been mowing it, would be my guess. But.
You know, I used 2,4-D and Banville or dicamba this year, and it really did an excellent job. And I probably applied it maybe a little bit too early, maybe the 3rd week in September, and I probably should have waited till closer to frost. But those 2 products combined did a pretty decent job. So.
Yeah, it's been so dry in Bozeman that I don't, like my own lawn, there's not much growing in it at all. So I don't know, even with even the Canada thistle might not be growing much unless he's watering.
Okay, this is a good question. A 12-year-old student from Bozeman loves science. They are curious, Michelle, how many honeybees it takes to make a pound of honey? I want to know too.
Yeah, you know, this is a hard one, and I was gonna say, now I forget this little factoid here. I do teach a 4th grade, sometimes we do 4th through 6th, this Honeybee Investigators course as part of Peaks and Potentials in the summer. I think it's, you know, one bee, I think, produces about 1/16 of a teaspoon of a honey in her lifetime. So I'm gonna give the math question back to the 12-year-old. So one bee, 1/16 of a teaspoon, so they're gonna need to calculate to pounds and then calculate the number of bees, but I can't do that in my head on air.
I would not be surprised if we heard back by the end of the program.
That'd be great. That'd be great.
I know when I heard that stat, I really started becoming way more careful with honey and how I use it.
Yeah.
Because that's such a small amount of honey when you think about even a teaspoon of honey.
It's true.
That you might stir into your tea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there are about 40,000 bees in an average honeybee colony. So if that kind of makes you feel a little bit better. And we have about, 300,000, 270, 300,000 of colonies in Montana here. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm still going to be careful.
They work hard. From Bozeman, Facebook question. They have hundreds of black bugs coming into their house. They don't seem to be doing anything harmful. They're not sure what they are, and they'd like to know, is there anything they need to do about them?
Well, we are getting we have a couple of invasive seed bugs that are coming in, and they were introduced from Europe several years ago. And there's some that are about the 1/4 to 1/2 inch, and the biology is kind of poorly understood, but I don't know if I'm pronouncing this weed right, the common mullein?
Mullein.
Common mullein. One of them likes common mullein, and a lot of them are associated with abandoned pastures. So some people just get dozens of these, if that's what they are. Some get dozens of these bugs that come in at once, and they like to hide in firewood too. But there's not a good way to control them except to maybe just vacuum them up and just know that also like the Western conifer seed bug, they're not reproducing in the home.
Okay.
But they're annoying. Yeah.
This has been a good year for all kinds of bugs.
Yes,
The Millers are gone now.
they're gone. Yep, the
Finally.
last couple that were in my house are gone.
And our
going back
vacuum
to the
sweeper
crops.
is pretty full. So
Yeah,
it was an amazing year for Miller moths.
it sure was. Good for the grizzlies.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had a lot to feed on.
They're Army cutworm moth, if I remember.
Yeah, they are. Yep.
Okay, here's one I have not heard of before, and we're going to see how smart Abby is here. He came from Billings, and the caller wants to plant something they call Egyptian or walking onions. And when is the best time to plant them? What are Egyptians or walking onions?
Yeah, so this is something I learned about recently. It's an unconventional onion. They're also called tree onions. They grow little bulbils in clusters, and you can harvest those bulbils and just plant those in the ground. And the best time to plant those is now. Is going to be in the fall. Just plant them a couple inches deep in the soil. You can also plant them in the spring, but the fall would be a great time to do that. But it's an interesting onion. I haven't tasted it, but
All
yeah.
onions are good.
Yeah.
Some are just better than others.
Is it planted as for a food crop or
Yeah.
is it an ornamental?
It's a food crop.
Okay.
Yeah, some of them, when I was reading about it, some of them taste really spicy. So depending on if you get the really young, tender ones or the older bulbils.
Okay.
But yeah, be interesting to try it.
Okay, thank you. I learned something. I've learned a lot tonight. I know, don't say it. It wasn't hard. Okay. From Darby, this is the second question we've had from Darby. This person would like to know, in Montana, what plants, crops, are dependent upon bees for pollination? Good question.
Yeah, so right away I think about cherries. You need bee pollinators for cherries. Also, if you're doing alfalfa seed production, you certainly need bees for seed production. Canola is another one that needs bee pollinators or benefits from that, especially for getting the seeds. And then, yeah, just in general, fruit, nuts, and vegetable crops. So, their smaller scale gardens need bee pollinators to produce those crops.
Okay. Do they help garden crops very much, or plants in the garden, any particular ones in a garden that rely on bees?
Yeah, I would say squashes do. A lot of wild and native bee pollinators are involved in that pollination as well. And in general, honeybees and wild pollinators kind of can pollinate the same area and work together to pollinate that garden. Bumblebees are responsible for pollinating your tomatoes. So, and to have bumblebees in your yard, you actually need some degree of bare earth because bumblebees nest in the ground. And so keeping a little bit of bare earth, not putting weed mat on everything, keeping some bare earth for those bumblebees to nest is really important because bumblebees do what's called buzz pollination, and that's critical for your tomatoes.
That brings a point. For the last 2 or 3 years until this year, I didn't see hardly any bumblebees. This year, even though it was wet and so forth, I saw a lot more bumblebees. Is there a reason for that?
I'll give it a shot and then I'll turn it over to Abby. But what I think of bumblebees is if you plant bumblebee forage, they will come. So the horticulture farm is an example of this. We have about a ½ an acre site there, a demonstration pollinator garden. And since planting that, we see loads of bumblebees out there. And so that has phlox, it has some bee balm, it has lamb's ear, asters, all these kind of flowering plants and having something bloom all the time and some open earth. We see lots of bumblebees out there. So I think keeping stuff in your yard will keep the bumblebees around.
Yeah, I agree with that if you plant it, they will come. And a lot of times, some of those flowering plants, especially those early season ones for the bumblebees, so having something flowering as soon as possible, that's when the queens are getting ready to start their own nest. Those are some of the most important resources for them starting out.
Okay, thank you. From Stevensville, Lori, in the past couple of weeks, they say they've seen many, many whiteflies in their yard. Should she treat her plants with insecticidal soap or neem oil or not worry about it?
Whiteflies aren't super common in the yard, so I'm wondering if it's something else. I wonder if it's maybe some aphids. And because we have some aphids that come into our elm trees, woolly apple aphids and woolly elm aphids that come into, they're coming back to overwinter on their trees. But I would suspect it might be something else, so I'd be happy to follow up. But and I think, where did she say they were landing?
Got to look here, Stevensville.
Okay. Yeah, I just didn't. Definitely give me a call at 994-5704, and we'll follow up on that to try to figure out what type of insect that is. Maybe just a couple pictures would help, because I would suspect maybe, especially this time of year, that it'd be an aphid.
And this time of year, with impending cold temperatures, I wouldn't worry about hardly any insects in any area right now. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think some of the aphid situations coming back to the elm trees are, I mean, they're mass aggregating on the trunks. So it is an opportunity, if that is the case, to maybe spray some insecticidal soap or something like that, just to cut down on the populations. But normally you don't have to really do anything at all. But
You mentioned aphids, and I'm one of the few people that really like Brussels sprouts. And Michelle does too. Good Brussels sprouts can be grown here in the Gallatin Valley and probably many other areas of Montana. However, there are a lot of aphids that really cause most of them to prematurely rot because the aphids are fed on them. Is there anything I can do to reduce, myself included, the amount of aphids that you have?
well, sometimes I think it's hard to reach. They have a very waxy surface, so it's usually a cabbage aphid that does that. So I think if you could mix some sort of horticultural oil into your solution, that might help break down a lot of that waxy layer. But that's why a lot of insecticides haven't worked very well on that aphid, because that waxy layer is so hard to penetrate.
Okay, thank
Jack,
you.
I
Yeah.
have a suggestion.
Oh, here we go.
Just don't look very closely in the pot or your plate when you eat them.
Extra protein.
I'll put enough bacon in that it kind of
Right,
mass.
right.
Yeah.
The first time I tried growing Brussels sprouts, because I like Brussels sprouts, we ate them anyway, even with the bugs in them.
There you go,
I'm
Jane.
sure it doesn't
Insect
hurt you
protein.
one
Good
bit.
job.
That's right.
Okay, let's move on to Abby. This person had their lawn, and this is in Helena, sprayed by a commercial operator for broadleaf weeds. Now they're raking their grass after they mow the yard. Is there a problem if they use that for mulch, winter mulch?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so if you have had your lawn treated, I would say the best thing to do if you are wanting to compost that, or if you want to use that as a mulch, is to wait for 2 to 3 mowings and then use it after that point. So that way you're not concerned about any sort of residual in your plant. So 2 to 3 mowings.
I think that's probably very good advice. And I have a question here, again, they came in on Facebook. They heard about the honeybee collapse syndrome. They'd like to know a little bit more about that. So is that still a problem? And if so, how do you address that?
Yeah, so colony collapse disorder was probably coined in around 2008, and it was a term to describe honeybee colony losses that we didn't really understand, but that weren't due to, overt mites infestation, or the queen died, and so then the colony can't survive without a queen, or they had plenty of food. And since that time, really, and what my lab focuses on about here at Montana State is just colony losses in general, not this particularly colony collapse syndrome. And unfortunately, colony losses in the U.S. have still averaged about 38% since from 2008 to 2018. And so we do have high colony losses, and our commercial beekeepers have done an amazing job mitigating those losses. And how they do that is they split their colonies to make up the loss. So a beekeeper can get 2 colonies from one colony if that colony is healthy and robust. But we are still experiencing, I would say, high annual colony losses in the U.S. And that's one of the main focuses of research in my lab, is try to mitigate those colony losses that are associated with viral infections.
Okay, thank you. Question from Manhattan. This person has what he thinks is either quackgrass or reed canary grass growing in their barley. Now, I know that's not your specialty. It's still green generally into October, even after harvest. Can they control it at that time? You want to render a guess?
Yeah, I don't feel like I have a good answer for that. So it's potentially it's a perennial grass that's in their barley. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, it'd be in their stubble now and it's coming back.
Yeah.
I think you can go
I
on with
wonder if
Roundup.
just a Roundup application, if everything's been harvested and it's just stubble, it seems like a Roundup application would be what would make the most sense.
I think so.
Yeah, the best person to talk to get better answers than I can give would be Tim Seipel, who's our cropland weed specialist. And I don't remember Tim's number right off the top of my head, but
Well,
he'll probably be on the show in a
Yeah,
couple weeks.
he will be. He'll be back. We'll save that again for
Okay.
him. From Nye, first question we've ever had from Nye. It's not a huge community. It's a neat little area. They have a lot of chew marks on their lilac. And do you have any idea what that might be?
We have a lot of root weevils that will chew little notches on lilac leaves, and I think that's probably most often what it is. If it's just little tiny notches on the sides, that's probably lilac root weevil, and we have a couple other root weevil species that will do that. It's really not doing anything to the lilac, but we do have quite a lot of damage from those root weevils. But they do come inside sometimes too. But yeah, I would just let them be.
Yeah.
Kind of a misnomer there, root weevil chewing up the leaves.
Kind of what?
Misnomer there, root weevil is chewing up the leaves.
Yeah,
So,
I know. Yeah. I mean, as immatures, they feed on roots, but typically
Okay.
here they haven't been causing that much damage to any of our roots. But with the numbers that we're seeing, maybe you can never say never for that. So we might start to see root damage, but it's the larvae that are doing the immatures that are doing the damage.
A follow-up question, and I know this is really not your specialty, but this person says they've had grasshoppers for 2 or 3 years in a row in large numbers. Do you think that cycle will turn down over the next couple of years?
I think I've said on the show before, I'm really terrible at predicting grasshopper populations, and I feel for the grasshopper people they're having issues. It's really an epidemic in certain areas, and I haven't seen a lot of eastern Montana where we've had just biblical proportions of grasshoppers. But I mean, they're supposed to go through outbreak situations or outbreak cycles, and I mean, this outbreak cycle has been going on for quite a while, and I'm not sure with overlapping populations and high populations. They're supposed to overwinter in the egg stage, but we have lots of overlapping generations, and it's pretty tricky to predict. So, I mean,
You know, it's interesting. We had Ken Wasson on here last week. He farms and ranches north of Malta. And he said they had a lot of grasshoppers early, but since there was nothing green for them to feed on because they're in a very extreme drought up in that area, that the grasshopper population has dropped off. Is that a natural type of biological control, would you think?
no resources. Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on what stage they are. I mean, the migratory grasshopper can migrate several miles, so I'm not sure if they find a
that's true.
resource.
Okay. Well, I had to throw some tough questions at you guys so you'd think here. It's more fun that way. Abby, this person from Missoula would like to know, is it best to deadhead their perennials in the fall or in the summer? And you tell them what deadheading is.
Yeah, that's a good question. So deadheading is when you cut back your spent flower stalks and branches for a lot of your perennial plants. And I would recommend not deadheading in the fall because we were talking about native bees. About 30% of native bee species are cavity nesting species, so they'll nest in existing cavities or they'll excavate little cavities out of pithy stems, things like raspberry canes. They'll nest in those hollow twigs of grasses, things like that. So not cutting those back in the fall means you're leaving that extra habitat, the nesting habitat for these native bees. So I would recommend waiting until the following year before you cut your perennials back to leave that habitat.
Good advice. And out of the, that leads me to a question I have. We have how many different types of bees in Montana? You don't have to tell me the exact number, but roughly how many different types and species?
We have between 500 to 750 estimated, and possibly even more is what the Wild Bees of Montana scientists are estimating. And we also have the most bumblebee species of any state. We have 28 species of bumblebees that can be found here, which is really cool.
Yeah, it is kind of cool when you stop and think about it. Very diverse. And you know, Montana agriculture is pretty diverse too, which serves well for a lot of these different species. So, good information. I learned something again tonight. Question from Facebook. They are on dry land and they have bull thistle. What should they do to get rid of bull thistle? And you might explain the different types of thistles that we have in the
Yeah,
state.
so we have probably 5 to 8 different exotic thistles in Montana. We also have about a dozen native thistles in Montana. But people are probably most familiar with Canada thistle, which is a rhizomatous thistle. It has that extensive root system. It's a perennial. But something like bull thistle, musk thistle, Scotch thistle, those are all actually biennial thistles. So they're vegetative one year, and then the next year they shoot up that flowering stem, flower, produce their seeds, and then that plant dies. They're actually easier to manage than Canada thistle, and you want to, if you have plants that have already seeded out, they've flowered and seeded, those plants are dead, so you don't want to spend any time managing them. You really need to manage those biennial thistles like bull thistle when they're in that vegetative stage. So when you have those big, thorny-looking rosettes and they haven't sent that flowering stem up, you can mechanically control them. They're actually kind of fun to just use a spade and cut them.
I can
Jack,
find
you're making faces at me.
I've done that. That's fun.
Yeah, thank you, Lori. You can use a spade to just cut those thistles, a couple inches below the surface of the soil. You can use herbicides and spray those rosettes. You can mow if you let them grow up. You can mow them off when they're in the flowering stage, but before they start to produce seeds. So the biennial thistles, there's actually quite a few options for managing them.
Okay.
I will say, since we're talking a lot about pollinators tonight, it's amazing how many pollinators you see on musk thistle, bull thistle, Scotch thistle. I mean, they have these big, beautiful flower heads, and they are magnets for a lot of our native wild bees that I have noticed.
They ought to be happy around Bozeman.
Yeah.
There's plenty of bull.
Everywhere there's lots
Okay.
of thistle, yeah.
I'm sitting here looking at that cage that Lori has down there, and I know, is that Pete or is that George, your favorite pet?
I actually named her Gladys because I had a feeling that people were going to ask for what her name was. So she is a banded argiope spider, and she is from Broadus, Montana. We have them all around the state. And she is quite large right now because she's getting ready to deliver an egg sac at some point. And that's the stage that will overwinter. And so we've seen this. Last year we had a big year, and they're an orb weaving spider. So they're also called a type of garden spider. So they build really, really large spiral webs. And she makes a very good pet, and she's actually, probably won't see her too much longer, but she will leave the egg sac with me, and hopefully the spiderlings will hatch in the spring.
I feel like I can ask this question because I get a lot of questions on the Bee Movie, but what kind of spider was Charlotte?
Charlotte was an orb weaver. Yeah. Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
I did not know that.
She built that orb web, and she made those beautiful messages in there. And
Okay.
yep, that was the type of spider
I
she
feel
was.
more fond about this one here by me.
Yeah, people forget about Charlotte, but it's October, so it should be Spider Month, and definitely Spider Week during Halloween week. So it's
Yeah, cool.
Spider Appreciation time here right now.
Lori, will she die then after she delivers the egg sac?
She will.
And
yes.
how old is that spider?
This spider is just an annual. They just live a year.
Okay, that's a big spider
It's a
for
big
1 year
spider.
of growth.
Yeah, yeah. She was feeding very well in Broadus. She had a lot of grasshoppers to feed on.
So how many offspring, just out of curiosity?
I don't know the answer to that. I'd say at least several dozen.
Okay.
Yeah, and they're cannibals, so I think at least a few will survive once the egg sac hatches. And
Interesting.
They
Nature
skipped
is
that
really
part
kind
of
of
Charlotte. They
fascinating.
skipped that part of Charlotte.
should have left that out.
Yeah.
Think of how wonderful Charlotte is.
Okay, here's a good one. And I'll throw this one to Jane. I always like to throw at least one curve. This person is wondering if deer droppings would make good fertilizer for a garden, or would it have weed seeds in it? He has lots of deer leaving droppings in his yard.
I get that question?
Yes, weed seeds.
Yeah, I thought Abby was going to get that one.
Well, you can share it.
Weeds, I wouldn't be that, I mean, seeds definitely can travel through animal droppings, for sure. I'm trying to think if deer would be eating weedy species when they're flowering or when they have seeds. I think that would be the key, is what are they browsing on?
Seems like leaves more than, right?
Yeah.
So maybe they wouldn't have the
Well,
seeds.
tulip heads for sure.
They eat everything in your yard, yeah. That's a good question. I would have to think more about like what a deer would be eating at the time of year when you would have weed flowers that have produced their seeds.
That could be a good question for Jared Beaver, the vertebrate specialist.
Yeah, the wildlife
Yeah.
specialist, yeah.
Yeah, well, and we'll try to get Jared on either this year or next spring.
Yeah,
I'll relay a little information that, what deer eat and so forth, but this is probably 20 years ago. And this happened out here in Manhattan where they had sprayed some Tordon on some noxious weeds in the gullies or coulees. And that's where the deer spent a lot of time. They'd snack on those plants. And in the evening, at dark, they'd go up into the alfalfa field and urinate. And you'd see spots like this. So I know some herbicides can pass through deer systems. I'm sure some seeds can too.
yeah, the growth regulator herbicides, some of them pass through livestock and wildlife unchanged. One comment I can make about seeds passing through animals. There has been work done with targeted grazing for weed control. And some of the work that's been done, including work here at MSU, shows that most of the seeds that pass through livestock, very few of them remain viable after passing through the digestive tract of sheep, goats, and cattle. So I don't know how deer, what their digestive system is relative to livestock, but I think it's like 10% of the seeds that would pass through and still be viable for livestock.
And
Okay.
maybe composting them would be a good way to mitigate that further.
Yeah.
As a follow-up question from Bozeman, they would like to know, and they've heard, that you should wash your car often after being in areas hunting or fishing where there are noxious weeds, because you can transmit noxious weed seeds via cars. Is that true?
Yes, definitely. I think this is a good question, thinking about hunting season coming up. A lot of off-road use, a lot of people driving around, a lot of weeds that have produced, they've produced seeds by now. There was actually some pretty interesting work done at MSU. Dr. Lisa Rue, she and her lab did a lot of work looking at how seeds move around on vehicles. And there were some kind of alarming numbers concerning how many seeds like an ATV can pick up, especially in the fall. It was even ATVs driving on trail could pick up close to 400 seeds per mile in the fall. And if they went off trail, it was like thousands of seeds per mile driven. So, and then those seeds can remain attached to vehicles for for many, many miles before they would drop off. So you think about a species getting picked up in one part of the state and dropped off in another part of the state. It's a very real thing. And the work that was done here at MSU is really good justification for the somewhat inconvenient activity of washing your vehicle and washing the undercarriage and the wheel wells.
On that note, let's just mention that with hunting season coming and people going in, what about weed-free alfalfa? You want to promote that a little bit while we're at it?
Yeah, so there is a weed seed-free forage program, and it includes gravel now in Montana. And if you're recreating on public land, and you're taking animals in, you are required to use weed seed-free forage. And that is an important part of hunting season. If people are packing in with animals, the last thing we want to do is take forage, alfalfa, hay, into the backcountry and drop some seeds of spotted knapweed or Canada thistle or bull thistle.
And is that food source readily accessible? Can people just go buy it, or how do you get that?
You can. So hay producers get certified as certified weed seed-free hay, and you can find producers. The Department of Ag has a website where you can find producers. You could probably also locate people through the extension offices. A lot of our extension agents and our county weed coordinators are certified inspectors, and they know who is producing locally.
Great. Is the supply down as well this year, like it was last year?
I think the hay production was way better this year than last year. I don't know if, in terms of weed seed free certified hay. I know the Department of Ag would always like to get more people producing the certified weed, and you get a premium for it. People will pay more for that.
You don't want it in large bales, though.
No, these are typically the small bales.
Okay. From Harlowton, they would like to know what are the best plants to draw honeybees to?
Yeah, so I would say some that are easy to grow would be bee balm, prairie coneflower, sandfoin is easy. Catmint even attracts a lot of different bees. Let's see, wildwood rose, wild geranium, asters, all of these would be great for bees. And actually, we have a pollinator health center here at Montana State University. And as part of that center, we have a resources webpage where we list a bunch of plants that are great for pollinators and have, Montana and Northwest targeted plants listed on that website. So that'd be a great place for them to check that out. Jane, do you have any other plants to add?
No, I think everything you mentioned is good. Yeah.
So if you live in the Gallatin Valley and you grow alfalfa, I'm sure there's plenty of dandelions in most alfalfa fields. Do the bees like the dandelions?
So I've heard, and maybe Abby will chime in here as well, but bees will go to dandelions, when there's nothing else there. But the minute those trees bloom, I feel like even here on campus, we see them move from the dandelions to the trees. So the minute there's something else for them to forage on, they seem to shift. Would you agree, Abby?
Yeah, I would say that too, but dandelions aren't that nutritious of a nectar source for bees. But yeah, if there's nothing else available, they're going to go to those plants.
Okay. Well, there's plenty of them around here, there's no doubt. From Phillipsburg, Facebook question. This person says there are thousands of insects that are covering the base of their elm tree. What are they doing, and should they be concerned? And I don't know what those would be. Lori, you have a clue?
I think is that the question that came in from Stevensville, that maybe it's the same thing, that maybe some of the aphids flying around and congregating on the trees, because we see that with elm trees, sometimes we see it with ash trees, and that would be what I'd be suspecting. So sometimes they look like little fairy aphids too. Sometimes I get those calls this time of year. They're woolly and winged, and they look like little angels. But I don't think people really think they're angels. But
Lori, what are they doing? Are they going into the bark to overwinter or laying eggs in there? Or?
So it depends on the species, but a lot of them are actually laying eggs in the bark. So the woolly elm aphid often uses apple as a secondary source. So sometimes they will overwinter in the roots, but mostly the other ones are laying eggs in the bark and around branches.
Well, we have you up, and this one is fascinating to me. It's from Kalispell. This person, she said they've seen a lot of ladybugs this year. They're wondering why.
Gosh, yeah, I haven't had a whole lot of lady beetle questions this year, so I'm not sure. I haven't.
They probably have a lot of aphids someplace there.
Yeah, so they do feed on aphids, but they call them generalist predators, so they feed on a whole variety of prey. So, but typically they're going after aphids. They're one of the first things that targets aphids when you see them on the plants. So
Okay.
yeah, probably a big aphid percentage in that area for sure.
Where do the ladybugs overwinter here?
I mean, I think That's a good question. So I don't know. I mean, I think some of them go to higher elevations, but then I don't know if they stay in those higher elevations. And I don't know if Abby, if you know the answer to that question. I'm not quite sure where they overwinter. So I know that they do become a resource for bears to feed on as well. But I'm not sure if they come back or.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Question from Billings. They said that they used to see a lot of what they called large beehives in alfalfa fields in the Hysham area. They don't see as many anymore. What's the deal with that?
So in Montana's beekeepers usually register their beekeeping sites with the Department of Ag, and so either that site is no longer or that beekeeper is no longer, or they found that that site, for whatever reason, they're not utilizing that site. But those sites are usually pretty coveted and pretty traditionally used by the same beekeepers. But they can move around their bees. You know, bees also need water and things like that, so that for a variety of reasons they might not be using that site.
You know, another thought there in that Hysham area, we used to have a lot of alfalfa seed producers, and they had these big alfalfa boards or whatever you called them. That might be what they were seeing out there.
Yeah, they have the alfalfa leafcutter bees, and those are the boards. Those are rather than honeybees. Yeah, and if the cut in the alfalfa before bloom, and like you mentioned, the leafcutter bees will certainly prefer to forage on alfalfa, where honeybees won't forage on it as much as these leafcutter bees will.
Okay, thank you. Quick one, Jane. Horiolism. This person is concerned about it. What can they do to slow it down?
Yeah, there's several different ways. I mean, you can use mechanical control, herbicides, cultural control. We do have what I think is a very nice extension publication on Horiolism that covers a lot of different management. So check out the MSU Extension store and look for Horiolism.
It's really increased in the last
Yeah.
few years. Okay. Folks, we're coming toward the end of another program. I want to thank the panel for being here this evening, especially Michelle, our special guest. Next week, we're going to have Corey Chigas here, who's an expert on coal seam fires. He's coming from Miles City to join us. We got that idea by looking at an article here in a magazine called High Country News, and it talked about the effects of coal seam fires on the sustainability of ranching operations out in the Potter River Basin. I'm going to learn a lot next week. I think you will too. Invite you to join us again. It's been a pleasure this evening. Thanks for the calls. Have a good week and good night.
For more information and resources, visit montanapbs.org/aglive.
Montana Ag Live is made possible by the Montana Department of Agriculture, the MSU Extension Service, the MSU Ag Experiment Stations of the College of Agriculture, the Montana Wheat and Barley Committee, Cashman Nursery and Landscaping, the Northern Pulse Growers Association, and the Gallatin Gardeners Club. Programming on Montana PBS is made possible in part by viewers like you, the friends of Montana PBS. Thank you. And by the Montana Farmers Union, a grassroots organization working for family farmers, ranchers, and rural communities. Online at montanafarmersunion.com.